gardener didn't do it, Grandma.
The gardener didn't do it. Those 5 words, whispered over and over by my 12-year-old granddaughter in the days after my son's murder, would tear apart everything I thought I knew about my family. They would lead me into a courtroom where sound itself became evidence, where my sweet Sophie's extraordinary hearing would expose a truth so devastating that even now, months later, I wake up choking on it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a perfect spring evening became the night that fractured my world. I still remember the weight of that Tuesday. The air hung thick and sweet with the scent of freshly turned earth. George had been working the garden all afternoon, preparing the beds for Daniel's beloved tomatoes. My son, my only child. God, even saying his name still splits me open. The house felt peaceful that evening, safe. Laura was upstairs with Sophie, helping her with homework. I could hear their voices drifting down, muffled and warm. Daniel had called from the road. He'd be home by 8, he said, his voice bright with anticipation. He always loved coming home to us. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not a crash, not a shout. Just a dull, heavy thud that seemed to suck all the air from the room. My hands froze over the cutting board, the knife trembling against the tomato I'd been slicing. For a moment, one terrible, suspended moment, I told myself it was nothing. A book falling, a door slamming, anything but what my body already knew it was. Then came the silence, that awful, suffocating silence that follows violence. I don't remember running to the living room. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because suddenly Laura was there, her face bone white, her hands clutching Sophie's shoulders, as my granddaughter stood rigid in the doorway, her eyes unfocused and distant, the way they get when the world becomes too loud for her sensitive ears. Daniel lay crumpled near the garden door, blood pooling dark and obscene against our hardwood floor. The door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, and through it I could see the garden, our beautiful, innocent garden, waiting in the twilight like it had witnessed nothing at all. The police came. They asked their questions with clinical efficiency, their voices scraping against my raw nerves. They found George's work glove near the body, stained with my son's blood. His truck had been spotted on our street around the time of death. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd always been quick to gossip, said she'd seen him arguing with Daniel weeks earlier about unpaid wages. It was perfect, too perfect, though I didn't see it then. I was drowning in grief, suffocating under the weight of a mother's worst nightmare. When they led George away in handcuffs, I wanted to believe them. God help me. Part of me needed someone to blame, someone to hate, someone whose face I could attach to the howling void where my son used to be, but Sophie, my strange, brilliant, broken Sophie. She stood at the window as they drove George away, her small hand pressed flat against the glass. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. When I went to her, when I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with those enormous dark eyes, Daniel's eyes, and whispered it for the first time. The gardener didn't do it, Grandma. I told her she was confused, traumatized. That grief makes children say strange things. I smoothed her hair and held her close, feeling her thin body trembling like a trapped bird. But she said it again the next day, and the day after that. Always the same 5 words delivered in that flat, certain tone she uses when she's absolutely sure of something she's heard or seen or sensed in her own peculiar way. You have to understand. Sophie isn't like other children. She hears the world differently. Every whisper, every vibration, every microscopic shift in the air around her registers with painful clarity. Sounds that you and I would never notice. She catalogs and remembers with perfect precision. It's her gift and her curse. The doctors call it savant syndrome. Paired with autism, I call it seeing the world naked, stripped of all the comfortable lies the rest of us wrap ourselves in. And if Sophie said George didn't do it, if she'd heard something that night, something the police missed, then everything was wrong. The arrest was wrong, the evidence was wrong, and somewhere the real killer was still breathing free. That realization came to me slowly, like ice water seeping through fabric. It soaked into my bones over sleepless nights and hollow days, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Until the doubt became unbearable. I'm 72 years old. I taught English literature for 40 years. I've buried a husband and now a son. I thought I'd learned everything there was to know about pain and loss and the quiet dignity of endurance. I was wrong, because pursuing the truth, real truth, the kind that tears families apart and exposes the rot beneath respectable surfaces, that requires a different kind of courage, the kind that would force me to look at my own daughter-in-law and wonder what secret she was hiding behind those carefully composed expressions. The kind that would make me question whether the woman who'd given me a granddaughter, who'd slept under my roof for 15 years, could be capable of something unthinkable. I went to see George in prison. I don't know what I expected, rage maybe, or bitter accusations. But when he sat down across from me, separated by scratched plexiglass, he just looked tired, defeated. His weathered hands lay flat on the table, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Walker," he said gently, like he was comforting me instead of the other way around. I wasn't there that night. 5 words, just like Sophie's 5 words, but these ones broke something inside me. I believed him, and that belief, that terrible, necessary belief, meant I had to find out who really killed my son, even if the truth destroyed everything I had left, even if it meant discovering that evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it lives in your own house, wearing a familiar face, speaking in a voice you've trusted for years. I had no idea then how Sophie's gift would become the key to everything, how her extraordinary hearing would reconstruct that night second by second, sound by sound, until the real killer's carefully constructed lies crumbled like ash. How a courtroom would fall silent as a 12-year-old girl with autism proved that truth has a frequency all its own, and some of us are born to hear it. But that comes later. First, I had to admit that I was angry, furious, actually, at George for being convenient, at the police for being lazy, at Laura for being too calm, at God for taking my son, at myself for not hearing what Sophie heard, at Daniel for leaving me with this unbearable burden of truth. The garden still blooms. Life continues with obscene indifference. And Sophie still stands at the window some mornings, her head tilted, listening to sounds only she can hear. The gardener didn't do it, she whispers to the glass, and now, finally, I'm ready to listen. Listening to Sophie, really listening, meant acknowledging that everything the police had built their case on might be smoke and mirrors. It meant accepting that my comfortable world, where gardeners stay gardeners and daughters-in-law stay innocent, might be far more sinister than I'd ever imagined. The evidence against George looked airtight. That's what Detective Morrison kept telling me when I called him that first week, my voice shaking with something I couldn't quite name yet. Rage? Fear? Hope? "Mrs. Walker," he said with strained patience, like he was explaining basic math to a confused child, "we found his glove at the scene, blood evidence. His GPS puts him on your street at the time of death. But did you check?" "We checked everything," he interrupted, his tone hardening into finality. "I understand you're grieving, but sometimes the obvious answer is the right answer." I hung up feeling dismissed, patronized, like a foolish old woman clinging to conspiracy theories because she couldn't accept reality. Maybe that's what I was. Maybe grief had hollowed me out and filled the empty spaces with paranoia. But then Sophie would appear in my doorway at odd hours, her thin frame backlit by hallway light, and whisper it again. "The gardener didn't do it, Grandma." Always the same words, always in that flat, certain voice that made my skin prickle. The police had presented their evidence at the arraignment hearing I forced myself to attend, sitting in the back row where George couldn't see me, where I couldn't see the betrayal in his eyes if he looked my way. The prosecutor was a young woman named Chen, no relation to our gossiping neighbor, thankfully. She laid out the case with clinical precision that made it sound utterly damning. The glove. George's work glove, caked with garden soil and Daniel's blood. Found less than 3 feet from my son's body, the GPS data, George's truck tracked to our street at 7:45 p.m. Daniel had died between 7:30 and 8, according to the medical examiner. The witness, Mrs. Chen from next door, who swore she'd seen George and Daniel arguing 2 weeks earlier. Something about money George claimed he was owed. And finally, the motive. George had been in debt, behind on his rent, facing eviction. He'd asked Daniel for an advance on his pay, and Daniel, my careful, budget-conscious son, had refused. It all fit together like a puzzle someone had forced into completion, jamming the pieces until they looked right from a distance. But up close? Up close, I could see the gaps. George had no history of violence, not even a speeding ticket in 20 years. He'd worked for our family for a decade, had been at Daniel's wedding, had helped plant the memorial roses when my husband died. Violence doesn't just erupt from nowhere in a man like that. It grows from something. From rage that's been festering, from desperation that's turned toxic. And I'd seen George that very afternoon, working in the garden while Daniel was still at work. He'd been humming, peaceful, planning out the fall plantings with that quiet contentment that was his nature. Does a man hum while planning murder? The GPS bothered me, too. George lived 6 blocks away. He walked everywhere, rain or shine, saving gas money. Why would he drive his truck to commit a crime? Why leave such an obvious trail? And the glove? George was meticulous about his tools. He kept everything organized in his shed, labeled and sorted. Would he really drop his glove at a murder scene and just leave it there? These questions churned in my mind as I watched George stand before the judge, his shoulders slumped, his weathered hands shackled. When the judge asked how he pleaded, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words cracked in the middle, raw with something that sounded less like defiance and more like defeat. That's when I knew, not with logic, not with proof, but with the same bone-deep certainty I'd felt when I knew my husband was dying months before the doctors confirmed it. When I knew Daniel had gotten into law school before the letter arrived. Some truths you don't reason your way to. You just know. I left the courthouse and drove straight to the county jail. The visiting room smelled like industrial cleaner in despair. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the sound drilling into my skull. I sat at one of the scratched plastic tables and waited, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. When they brought George out, he looked smaller, somehow diminished. Prison orange hung loose on his frame. His salt and pepper hair stood up in tufts where he'd been running his hands through it. He froze when he saw me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through the plexiglass barrier, 2 people who'd shared Sunday dinners and garden conversations now separated by more than just plastic. He picked up the phone. I picked up mine. "Mrs. Walker." His voice through the receiver sounded tinny, distant. "You shouldn't have come." "I needed to see you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I needed to ask you something." He waited, his dark eyes searching my face with something that looked like hope and fear braided together. "Did you kill my son?" The question hung between us like a blade. George's face crumpled, not with guilt, with grief. "No, ma'am," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I loved Daniel like my own. I wasn't there that night. I swear on my mother's grave, I wasn't there." Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. "They found your glove," I said, hating myself for pushing but needing to hear his answer. "I don't know how it got there." His hand pressed flat against the plexiglass, fingers splayed like he was trying to reach through. "I'd lost those gloves weeks ago, thought maybe I'd left them at another job. But Mrs. Walker, I've been wondering." He stopped. His eyes shifted left then right, checking if anyone was listening. "Wondering what?" I pressed. "If someone took them," he said quietly, the words heavy with implication. "If someone wanted it to look like me." The visiting room suddenly felt too cold, too bright. The buzzing fluorescent lights grew louder in my ears, a harsh electrical whine that reminded me, sickeningly, of how Sophie must hear the world, every sound amplified and sharp. "Who would do that?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this question led. George shook his head slowly. I don't know, but ma'am, that night, I was home alone. Fell asleep watching TV, nobody to vouch for me, and whoever did this, they knew that. They knew I'd have no alibi. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling over us like ash. I believe you, I finally said. His eyes widened, fresh tears spilled over. I don't know why yet, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I don't know how to prove it, but I believe you, and I'm going to find out what really happened. I didn't know then how those words would commit me to a path that would tear my family apart. How they would force me to look at Laura, my daughter-in-law, Sophie's mother, the woman who'd cried prettily at Daniel's funeral, and wonder if those tears were real or rehearsed. When I got home that evening, the house felt different, charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Laura was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision. Sophie sat at the table, drawing in her notebook, her colored pencils arranged in perfect chromatic order the way she always kept them. "Where were you?" Laura asked, without looking up, her knife moving in steady rhythm against the cutting board. Thunk, thunk, thunk. "Out," I said vaguely. She glanced at me then, her eyes cool and assessing. "You went to see him, didn't you? The man who killed Daniel." Not George, not the gardener. The man who killed Daniel already convicted in her mind. I needed answers, I said carefully. "And did you get them?" Her voice dripped with something I couldn't quite identify, contempt? Fear? Maybe. Sophie's pencil stopped moving. She looked up at me with those enormous dark eyes, and for just a second I saw Daniel looking back. My throat tightened. "Grandma believes Mr. George," Sophie said matter-of-factly, her voice carrying that flat affect that signaled she was processing something complex. "Grandma wants to know what I heard." Laura's knife paused mid-chop, the silence stretched thin and dangerous. "Sophie, honey," Laura said with forced lightness, "we've talked about this. You were confused that night, scared. Sometimes our minds—" "I wasn't confused," Sophie interrupted, still staring at me. "I heard what I heard. The sequence was wrong." "Sequence?" I asked, moving closer to the table. Sophie's hand began tapping the table in a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The door, the voices, the fall, then the footsteps. The order was wrong for it to be Mr. George. Laura's knuckles whitened around the knife handle. "That's enough, Sophie," she said sharply. "You're upsetting yourself." But Sophie kept tapping, kept staring at me. And in that moment, I realized my granddaughter hadn't just heard what happened that night. She'd recorded it. Every sound, every sequence, every impossible detail that would prove George's innocence, and someone in this kitchen knew it. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind through the eaves, they all sounded like warnings, like the house itself was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. By 3 a.m., I'd made my decision. If the police wouldn't listen, if they'd already convicted George in their minds, then I needed someone who would actually investigate. Someone who understood that truth isn't always obvious. Someone who owed me enough to try. Martin Hale. We'd known each other for 40 years. Ever since his daughter and Daniel were in the same kindergarten class, we'd served on the school board together, attended the same church, shared countless neighborhood barbecues where our husbands would argue about politics while Martin and I rolled our eyes and refilled drinks his wife had died 3 years ago. Cancer. I'd sat with him during those final weeks, holding his hand while he wept. So yes, he owed me, but more than that, I trusted him. And trust, I was learning, had become a rare and precious thing. Martin had been a defense attorney for 35 years before semi-retiring. He still took cases occasionally, the ones that interested him, that challenged him. He told me once that he couldn't quite let go, that he needed to feel useful, needed to believe he could still make a difference. Well, here was his chance. I called him at 7 a.m., right when I knew he'd be finishing his morning coffee. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly with age, but still sharp. "Evelyn," he said with cautious warmth, "it's early. Are you all right?" No, I said bluntly. I need your help, professional help. A pause, then carefully measured. What kind of help? The kind that proves an innocent man didn't kill my son. Another pause. Longer this time, I could almost hear him thinking, weighing whether to humor a grieving woman or tell me the hard truth. George Harris, he finally said. It wasn't a question. George didn't do it, Martin. Evelyn. I know how it sounds. I interrupted, my voice cracking despite my best efforts. I know the evidence looks solid, but something's wrong. The pieces fit too perfectly in Sophie. I stopped, unsure how to explain what my autistic granddaughter's hearing meant without sounding completely unhinged. Sophie, what? Martin pressed gently. She says he didn't do it. She heard something that night. Something that proves it wasn't George. The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Come to my office at 9, Martin finally said, his tone unreadable. Bring Sophie. Martin's office sat above a coffee shop on Main Street, accessible by a narrow staircase that smelled like espresso and old wood. The space itself was exactly what you'd expect. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather chairs worn soft with age, a massive oak desk buried under case files and yellow legal pads. He stood when we entered, his tall frame slightly stooped now, his gray hair thinning but still thick enough to look distinguished. He wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck. The sight of him, solid and real and familiar, made something in my chest loosen slightly. Evelyn. He took my hands in his grip warm and steady. Then he looked down at Sophie, who was staring intently at the Persian rug under her feet, counting something only she could see. Hello, Sophie, he said softly, not trying to make eye contact. He'd learned over the years how to interact with her, how to respect her boundaries. Sophie's lips moved silently, counting, always counting or measuring or organizing her way of making sense of a world that came at her too fast, too loud, too much. 73, she finally said, her voice flat and distant. There are 73 red threads in this section of pattern. That's quite observant, Martin said without condescension. He gestured to the chairs. Would you like to sit? We can talk about what you heard that night. Sophie's whole body went rigid. Her hands began their familiar flutter near her chest, fingers tapping against each other in rapid sequence, stress behavior. She was processing whether to trust this man, this situation, this conversation that would force her to revisit the worst night of her life. It's okay, sweetheart, I said quietly. Mr. Martin is Grandma's friend. He wants to help Mr. George. Sophie's tapping slowed. She moved to the chair with careful, deliberate steps, sitting on its very edge like she might need to flee at any moment I settled beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close I'd overwhelm her. Martin sat across from us, his lawyer face on now, neutral, patient, completely focused. Sophie, he began, his voice low and even. I need to ask you some questions about the night your father died. Is that okay? Sophie rocked slightly, back and forth, a small motion, barely visible. I heard things, she said to the carpet, things that don't match. Can you tell me what you heard? Sophie's rocking stopped, her eyes unfocused, the way they did when she was accessing her memory. And with Sophie, memory wasn't vague or emotional or unreliable like it is for the rest of us. It was exact, preserved, like a recording she could play back. The door opened at 7:41 p.m., she said in that flat, certain tone. Not the front door, the garden door. The hinges need oil. They make a sound like... She made a small creaking noise in her throat. High C sharp, sustained for 2.3 seconds. Martin's eyebrows rose slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. What happened next? Footsteps, dress shoes on hardwood, moving from the entry toward the living room. 13 steps, then Father's voice. My heart clenched. Father. She always called Daniel Father, never Dad or Daddy, too informal, too unpredictable. What did he say? Martin asked gently. Sophie's hands resumed their flutter. I don't know. The words were unclear, but the tone was surprised. Not angry, not scared, surprised. And then, another voice, quieter. I couldn't hear the words, then movement. Fast, a struggle. Something hit the floor. Heavy, that was Father falling. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was describing a scene in a movie instead of her own father's murder. But I could see her hands trembling now, see the way her breathing had gone shallow. "You're doing so well, Sophie," Martin said, his voice thick with something that might have been admiration. "Can you tell me what happened after your father fell?" This is where it got strange, where Sophie's account diverged from the neat story the police had constructed. "Footsteps," Sophie said, walking away toward the garden door. Heels, not dress shoes anymore, heels, the kind with hard tips that click, 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 click. 23 steps. Heels. George wore work boots, always work boots, heavy and clunky and definitely not heels. Martin leaned forward slightly. "Are you certain it was heels?" "The frequency is different," Sophie explained, her voice taking on that lecturing quality she got when discussing technical details. "Work boots create a lower frequency impact, approximately 200 hertz. High heels create a sharper impact, 400 to 800 hertz depending on material and walking speed." These were high heels. Definitely high heels. Martin's pen scratched across his legal pad. What happened after the heels? Sophie's rocking resumed. The door closed, the same creak, high C sharp, then nothing for 47 seconds, then the door again. Different footsteps this time. Rubber soles running, heavy, and then Mother screaming. The room went very quiet. "Mother screaming," Martin repeated carefully. "Your mother, Laura." Sophie nodded, her eyes still unfocused, lost in that perfect memory. "But Sophie," Martin said, his tone shifting into something that sounded almost like cross-examination, "if your mother screamed when she found your father, that means she wasn't there when he fell, right?" Sophie's rocking stopped. Her eyes focused sharply on Martin for just a second before darting away. "Mother screamed," she repeated, "but I heard Mother's voice earlier too, before Father fell. It was Mother's voice in the quiet part, the part I couldn't understand." The air in the room turned to ice. Martin and I locked eyes. His face had gone very still, very careful, the face of a lawyer who just heard something that changed everything. "Sophie," I managed to say, my voice barely working. "Are you saying you heard your mother's voice twice? Once before Father fell, and once when she screamed?" Sophie began tapping her sequence again. Fingers against fingers, counting something we couldn't see. "Yes," she said simply. "Mother was there. Then Mother left. Then Mother came back. But the police think Mr. George was there. The timeline is wrong, the sounds are wrong, everything is wrong." She looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not confusion, not innocence, fear. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice dropping into something small and terrified. "I don't want to tell the police this. If I tell them Mother was there, something bad will happen, something worse than Father dying." Martin set down his pen with deliberate care. His hands were shaking slightly. "Sophie," he said quietly, "do you know what your mother and father were talking about? That night before he fell?" Sophie's whole body began to tremble. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she didn't seem to notice them. "Insurance," she whispered. "Mother said the word insurance, and Father said no." And Mother's voice went sharp, and then the sound started happening wrong. She looked at me with those enormous, terrified eyes. "Grandma, I think Mother hurt Father. I think Mother is why Father died. But I don't want it to be true. I want the gardener to be guilty. I want everything to be simple again." The truth hung between us like smoke, visible, undeniable, suffocating. And in that moment, I realized we'd crossed a line. There would be no going back, no unhearing what Sophie had told us, no unknowing what we now knew. My daughter-in-law had killed my son, and my granddaughter had heard every second of it. Going home felt like walking into a trap. Martin had wanted us to stay at his place, offered us his guest room, even offered to call the police right then and there, but I refused. Because if Laura suspected anything, if she knew what Sophie had just revealed, she might run, might destroy evidence, might do something desperate. And desperate people, I was learning, were capable of terrible things. Besides, I needed to see her. Needed to look into the eyes of the woman who'd slept under my roof for 15 years and see if I could spot the monster hiding there. Needed to understand how someone could kill the father of her child and then sit at the dinner table like nothing had happened. The drive home took 12 minutes. Sophie sat beside me in silence, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her leg, counting again, or maybe praying. With Sophie, it was hard to tell the difference. "Are you going to tell Mother what I said?" she asked suddenly, her voice small and frightened. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "No, baby, not yet." "Good." A pause, then barely audible. "I'm scared of her now." God, what had I done? What had we uncovered that couldn't be put back? "I know," I whispered. "I'm scared too." The house looked the same as always. White clapboard siding, black shutters, the garden stretching out back, lush and green and innocent. But everything felt different now, contaminated, like the walls themselves had absorbed Laura's crime and were holding it inside, waiting to release it. Laura's car sat in the driveway. She was home. We found her in the living room, sitting exactly where Daniel had died 3 weeks earlier. The bloodstain was gone. She'd had the floors professionally cleaned within days, but I could still see it. Could still see the dark outline of where my son had fallen. She looked up when we entered, her face arranged in that careful expression of gentle concern she'd perfected. "There you are," she said warmly, though something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Where did you two run off to?" "Just needed some air," I lied, keeping my voice steady. "Took Sophie for a drive." Laura's gaze slid to Sophie, who stood frozen in the doorway, her whole body rigid with tension. "You okay, baby?" Laura asked, her tone dripping with maternal sweetness that now sounded obscene. "You look pale." Sophie didn't answer, didn't move, just stared at her mother with those wide, knowing eyes. The silence stretched until Laura laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. "Sophie? Honey?" "I'm fine," Sophie finally managed, her voice flat and mechanical. She turned and fled upstairs, her footsteps pounding an irregular rhythm that spoke of barely controlled panic. Laura watched her go, then turned back to me with manufactured worry creasing her forehead. "She's been so withdrawn lately. I'm concerned about her." "She watched her father die," I said bluntly. "Of course she's withdrawn." Something flashed across Laura's face, too quick for me to identify. Guilt? Fear? Anger? "Yes," she said softly, her voice taking on that wounded quality she used when she wanted sympathy. "We all did. We're all traumatized. I just wish—" She stopped, dabbing at her eyes even though they were dry. "I just wish the police would hurry up every day that monster walks free in a jail cell instead of being—" "Instead of being what?" I interrupted. "Executed? George hasn't been tried yet, Laura. He's still innocent until proven guilty." Her jaw tightened, just for a second, just long enough for me to see the mask slip. "Of course," she said carefully. "I just meant, with all the evidence, it seems like a formality, don't you think?" I didn't answer, just watched her, studied her the way you'd study a snake, trying to predict when it might strike. She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm going to make dinner. Sophie likes chicken on Wednesdays." She walked past me toward the kitchen, trailing a perfume that smelled like Lily's funeral flowers. The scent made my stomach turn. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Every sound in the house felt amplified, threatening the creak of floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind against windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, moving past my room toward the stairs. I got up, my heart hammering, and cracked open my door just enough to see out. Laura, dressed in dark clothes, carrying her purse, moving like a ghost through the darkness. I waited until she descended the stairs, then followed, keeping to the edges where the floorboards wouldn't creak. Years of navigating this house at night to check on a young Daniel had taught me where to step. She went to Daniel's old study, the room we'd kept locked since his death, preserving it exactly as he'd left it. I watched through the gap in the door as she pulled out a key, unlocked it, and slipped inside. The desk lamp clicked on. Warm light spilled across Daniel's papers, his books, his computer. Laura moved with purpose, opening drawers, sorting through files looking for something. Or hiding something. She found what she wanted in the bottom drawer, a manila folder I recognized. Daniel's insurance papers, the life insurance policy he'd updated just 6 months ago. The one that named Laura as sole beneficiary for $500,000. I watched her flip through the documents, her lips moving silently as she read. Then she pulled out her phone, took photos of several pages. Her hands shook as she worked, making the photos blurry. She cursed under her breath, a sharp, vicious sound, and tried again. After she'd photographed what she needed, she started to put everything back, but then she stopped, pulled out another document, stared at it for a long moment. Even from my position by the door, I could see what it was, a printout of an email. Daniel had printed it, highlighted sections in yellow, made notes in the margins in his careful handwriting. Laura's face went white, then red, then twisted into something I'd never seen before. Pure rage. She crumpled the paper in her fist, her whole body shaking with fury barely contained. "You bastard," she hissed at the empty room, her voice raw and venomous. "You absolute bastard. You were going to leave me with nothing." She sank into Daniel's chair, the crumpled paper clutched against her chest, and began to cry. But these weren't tears of grief. They were tears of rage, of frustration, of someone who'd been backed into a corner and had lashed out. I backed away from the door, my legs weak, my mind racing. Daniel had been planning something that threatened Laura, something that made her desperate enough to kill. And whatever it was in that crumpled email. The next morning, Laura was her usual composed self, making breakfast, humming softly, acting like she hadn't been prowling through the house at 2 a.m., cursing her dead husband and crying tears of rage. Sophie came down for breakfast but wouldn't look at her mother, wouldn't speak, just ate her oatmeal in mechanical bites, counting each spoonful under her breath. Laura tried to engage her. "Sophie, honey, do you want to go to the park after breakfast? Feed the ducks like we used to?" Sophie's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "No. Baby, we need to—" "No." Firmer this time. Sophie set down her spoon with deliberate care. "I don't want to go anywhere with you." Laura's smile froze. "Sophie, that's not nice. I'm your mother. We need to spend time." "My father is dead," Sophie interrupted, her voice taking on that lecturing tone, that flat affect that meant she was stating facts, not feelings. "You were there when he died. You left, you came back. The police don't know about the heels. The police don't know about insurance. The police think Mr. George did it, but Mr. George didn't do it." The kitchen went absolutely silent. Laura stared at her daughter, her face draining of color. Her coffee cup trembled in her hand, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "What did you say?" she whispered, the words barely audible. Sophie looked at her mother directly for the first time in days. "I heard you," she said simply. "I hear everything. I always hear everything." The cup slipped from Laura's fingers and shattered on the tile floor. Coffee splashed across the white cabinets, across Laura's legs, across Sophie's feet, but nobody moved. Laura's eyes found mine across the table. And in that moment, we both knew. The pretense was over. The careful dance was done. She knew that we knew, and now we had to figure out what she'd do about it. "Sophie," Laura said, her voice eerily calm despite the coffee dripping down her legs, "go to your room." "No," Sophie said, "go to your room." Each word enunciated with barely controlled fury. Sophie looked at me. I nodded. She fled. Laura and I sat across from each other in the ruined kitchen, the smell of coffee thick in the air, the shattered cup between us like broken trust made visible. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice dead and flat. "Long enough," I said. She laughed then, a horrible sound, empty of anything human. You can't prove anything, she said. Sophie's autistic, unreliable. No court would believe her over hard evidence. Are you willing to bet your freedom on that? Her smile turned sharp, dangerous. Are you willing to bet Sophie's safety? The threat hung in the air between us, more shocking than if she'd pulled a knife. You wouldn't hurt your own daughter, I said, but my voice wavered. Laura leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine. I killed my husband for money and freedom, Evelyn. What makes you think I wouldn't do whatever's necessary to protect myself? The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just a murderer, she was a monster, and that monster was threatening my granddaughter. I stood up, my legs shaking but my voice steady. If you touch Sophie, if you even look at her wrong, I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison. I will testify. I will bring Martin. I will make Sophie tell her story to anyone who'll listen until somebody believes us. Will you? Laura stood too, matching my height, her face inches from mine. Because I think you love Sophie too much to put her through a trial, to make her relive her father's murder on a witness stand while lawyers tear her apart, to make her the reason her mother goes to prison. She was right. God help me, she was right. Sophie was fragile. The trauma of testifying, of being questioned and doubted and attacked, it might break her. Think about it, Laura continued, her voice softening into something worse than anger. Calculation. George takes the fall. Nobody else gets hurt. Sophie never has to testify. You keep your granddaughter safe and whole. Isn't that worth one man's freedom? She waited for my answer, a small smile playing at her lips. Confident. Sure of herself. Sure that a grandmother's love would outweigh a grandmother's conscience. And standing there in that kitchen with my son's killer offering me a devil's bargain, I realized something terrible. Part of me wanted to take it. But I didn't take it. I couldn't. Because that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I kept seeing Daniel's face. Not as he'd looked in death, but as he'd been at 7 years old, standing in our backyard with a monarch butterfly cupped gently in his small hands. Look, Mama, he'd whispered, his voice full of wonder. It trusts me not to hurt it. My son had believed in truth, in doing the right thing even when it was hard, even when it cost him. He'd lost friendships defending unpopular positions, lost job opportunities because he wouldn't compromise his ethics. And in the end, he'd lost his life because he'd discovered something about Laura, something in that crumpled email that threatened her comfortable existence. If I let George rot in prison to protect Sophie from testimony, I'd be betraying everything Daniel stood for, everything he'd taught me about integrity and courage and the hard work of being good. So I called Martin at 6 a.m. and told him 3 words. We move forward. There was a long silence. Then quietly he said, Are you sure, Evelyn? Once we start this, there's no stopping it. Sophie will have to testify. Laura will fight back. It's going to get ugly. It's already ugly, I said. Let's make it true. Martin worked fast. He filed a motion for a new preliminary hearing, arguing that critical evidence had been overlooked. He subpoenaed phone records, financial documents, security footage from neighboring houses. He hired an audio forensics expert to verify Sophie's timeline. And he convinced the judge to allow Sophie to testify. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks of living in that house with Laura, both of us pretending we weren't at war. 3 weeks of watching her watch Sophie with eyes that calculated and measured and planned. I moved Sophie's bed into my room, locked both our doors at night, kept her close during the day. Laura protested, of course, with that wounded mother voice, but I didn't care. Not anymore. The trial began on a Tuesday in late August. The courthouse smelled like wood polish and nervous sweat. The gallery filled quickly. News of an autistic child witness had drawn reporters and curious locals. Everyone wanted to see if the grief-stricken grandmother had lost her mind. George was led in, wearing a suit Martin had brought him. He looked smaller in civilian clothes, older. His eyes found mine across the courtroom, and I saw the question there. Why are you doing this? Why give me hope when hope is dangerous? I couldn't answer, could only nod slightly and pray I wasn't destroying him all over again. The prosecution went first. Assistant D, A. Chen, still no relation to our gossiping neighbor, presented her case with ruthless efficiency. The glove. She held it up in a plastic evidence bag dark with dried blood. Found 3 feet from the victim's body, she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. DNA testing confirms this is Mr. Harris's work glove. The blood is Daniel Walker's. The GPS records. She displayed a map showing George's truck on our street at 7:42 p.m. Right in the window of death, she said triumphantly. The financial motive. She presented bank statements showing George's mounting debts. Desperate men do desperate things, she intoned gravely. And finally, the witness. Mrs. Chen took the stand, her face solemn with the weight of civic duty. She testified that she'd seen George and Daniel arguing heatedly 2 weeks before the murder. About money, she said with certainty. I heard Mr. Harris shouting about being cheated. It was devastating perfect, every piece fitting together into a narrative that felt inevitable. Then Martin stood up. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. The defense calls Sophie Walker. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged her gavel, a sharp crack that made Sophie flinch even from the hallway where she waited. I went to get her, found her sitting on a bench, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on the tile pattern beneath her feet. Counting again, always counting. It's time, sweetheart, I said gently. She looked up at me with those enormous dark eyes. I don't want to, she whispered, her voice thin and frightened. Everyone will look at me. Everyone will think I'm lying because I'm different. I know. I knelt down, taking her cold hands in mine. But Mr. George needs you and your father. Your father would want you to tell the truth, even when it's scary. Especially when it's scary. Sophie's lower lip trembled, but she stood. Because that's what Walker women do. We stand. The courtroom went silent as Sophie entered. Every eye tracked her small form as she walked to the witness stand, her steps measured and deliberate, her hands fluttering at her sides. The court officer held out the Bible for her to swear on. Sophie stared at it with confusion. I can't swear, she said flatly. Swearing is imprecise. I can only promise to report what I heard accurately. A few people laughed, nervous, uncertain. The judge's lips twitched with what might have been amusement. That will suffice, the judge said kindly. Please sit down. Sophie perched on the edge of the witness chair, her feet not quite reaching the floor. She looked impossibly small, impossibly vulnerable. I wanted to run up there and snatch her away, take her somewhere safe where no one could hurt her, but Martin needed her, George needed her, truth needed her. Martin approached slowly, non-threateningly. Sophie, he said gently, can you tell the court what you heard on the night your father died? Sophie's hands began their familiar flutter, her eyes unfocused, accessing that perfect, terrible memory. The door opened at 7:41 p.m. She began in her flat, precise voice. The garden door. The hinges creak at high C sharp for 2.3 seconds. Someone in the gallery snorted. Another whispered. The judge shot them a warning glare. Sophie continued, undeterred. Footsteps, dress shoes, 13 steps from the door to where father was standing. Then father's voice, surprised tone. Then another voice, quieter. I couldn't distinguish words, but I could identify the speaker by vocal frequency and timbre. Who was the speaker? Martin asked. Sophie's hands stopped moving. She looked directly at Laura, who sat in the gallery with a carefully neutral expression. My mother, Sophie said. The courtroom exploded. The judge's gavel cracked repeatedly. Laura's face went white, then red. She started to stand, to protest, but her lawyer grabbed her arm and yanked her back down. Martin waited for silence. Then, what happened next, Sophie? Movement. Fast. A struggle. Father fell. Heavy impact, then footsteps leaving high heels. Not work boots. High heels create impact at 400 to 800 hertz depending on material and velocity. Work boots are approximately 200 hertz. These were definitely heels. 23 steps to the door closing, same C-sharp creak. She recited it all in that monotone voice, like reading a grocery list instead of describing her father's murder. But her hands trembled. Her breathing had gone shallow. And then, Martin prompted gently, 47 seconds of silence. Then the door opened again. Different footsteps, rubber soles, running, heavy. That was Grandma. Then Mother screaming. Mother had left and come back. Mother pretended to find Father, but Mother was there when Father fell. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling. Chen rose slowly, her face tight with anger, barely restrained. Your Honor, this is preposterous. The child is clearly confused, traumatized. Her autism makes her testimony unreliable at best, fabricated at worst. I'm not confused, Sophie said, her voice suddenly sharp, loud. She looked directly at Chen with an intensity I'd rarely seen from her. I hear everything. I remember everything. My autism doesn't make me a liar. It makes me accurate. A murmur ran through the gallery. Approving. Surprised? Sophie had just defended herself in a way I'd never heard her do before. But Chen wasn't done. She approached the witness stand like a shark sensing blood. Sophie, she said with false gentleness, you love your grandmother very much, don't you? Yes. Sophie's eyes tracked Chen warily. And your grandmother wants very badly to believe Mr. Harris didn't kill your father, isn't that right? Grandma wants the truth. But what if... Chen leaned in closer, her voice dropping into something that sounded almost kind but felt predatory. What if your mind created this story because you heard your grandmother's doubts? What if you're remembering what she wants you to remember instead of what actually happened? Sophie's hands resumed their frantic flutter. Her breathing quickened. She was starting to panic, starting to doubt herself the way she had in Martin's office. She began, then stopped. I heard what I heard. But her voice wavered, uncertain, the confidence cracking. Chen pressed harder. You said you heard your mother's voice before your father fell. But you also said you couldn't distinguish words. How can you be sure it was your mother if you couldn't hear what was being said? Sophie's eyes darted around the courtroom, landing on Laura, on me, on the exit, looking for escape. Vocal frequency, she whispered. Timbre. Everyone's voice has a unique acoustic signature. I can identify... But you were upstairs, weren't you? Chen interrupted smoothly. 2 floors away with your door closed. Are you telling this court that you can identify someone's voice from 2 floors away without hearing their words? Sophie's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I hear everything. Or maybe, Chen suggested, her tone shifting into something gentler, more sympathetic. You heard something that scared you, something that your mind couldn't process. And later, when your grandmother suggested Mr. Harris didn't do it, your mind filled in details that made sense of your confusion. That's not lying, Sophie. That's just how trauma works. Sophie looked at me with tears streaming down her face, her whole body trembling. Grandma, she whispered, I did hear her. I did, didn't I? And in that moment, I watched my granddaughter's certainty, her one gift, her one superpower, turn against her. Chen smiled. A small, victorious smile. No further questions, she said. Martin stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. The sound made Sophie flinch, made everyone in the courtroom turn to look. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying a barely contained urgency. I request a 15-minute recess to confer with my witness. The judge looked at Sophie, who was openly crying now, her hands pressed over her ears, rocking slightly in the witness chair. Something shifted in the judge's expression. Not quite sympathy, more like recognition of cruelty when she saw it. Granted, she said curtly, 15 minutes. I met Martin and Sophie in a small conference room that smelled like old coffee and desperation. Sophie wouldn't look at either of us, just stared at her hands, counting something on her fingers over and over, 1 through 10, then starting again. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I'm not good enough. I'm sorry I made everyone doubt Mr. George. I'm sorry I. Stop! Martin's voice was sharp enough to cut through her spiral. He knelt in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, without demanding she look at him. Sophie, listen to me. You are the most reliable witness I've ever encountered. Do you know why? She shook her head, still not looking up. Because you don't interpret, Martin continued, his tone gentle but fierce. You don't fill in blanks or make assumptions, you just record, like a high-fidelity microphone, and that prosecutor knows it. That's why she tried so hard to make you doubt yourself. But I'm 2 floors away, Sophie said, her voice small and defeated. How could I know it was Mother's voice if I couldn't hear the words? Martin glanced at me. I could see him making a decision, a risky one. Can you identify my voice from across a crowded room? He asked Sophie. Yes. Can you tell me apart from another man my age if we're both whispering? Yes, your voice has more upper harmonics, around 2,000 hertz. Most older male voices drop below 1,500. Martin's eyebrows rose. Could you prove it? Sophie finally looked up, her tear-stained face showing the first spark of interest. Prove it how? In court, Martin said carefully, in front of everyone. Show them what you can actually hear. I watched Sophie process this, watched the gears turning behind those dark eyes. She was terrified, that much was obvious, but she was also intrigued, challenged, and Sophie had always risen to challenges when they involved proving what her unique brain could do. What would I have to do? She asked cautiously. Martin smiled. Just what you do best. Listen. When we returned to the courtroom, Martin addressed the judge with a calm confidence that belied the gamble he was taking. Your Honor, Ms. Chen has suggested that my witness cannot reliably identify voices without hearing words. I'd like to conduct a simple demonstration to prove otherwise. Chen shot to her feet. Objection. This is theater, not testimony. This is evidence, Martin countered smoothly. Ms. Chen challenged the witness's credibility. I'm entitled to rehabilitate it. The judge considered, her fingers drumming on the bench. I'll allow it, but make it quick, Mr. Hale. Martin nodded. He turned to the bailiff, a heavy-set man named Raymond who'd been standing by the door. Officer Raymond, would you please go to the back of the courtroom? Raymond looked confused, but complied, walking the 40 feet to the rear wall. The courtroom buzzed with speculation. What was Martin doing? Officer Raymond? Martin called out. Would you please whisper something? Anything you'd like, but whisper it so quietly that only you can hear it. Raymond looked around, clearly uncomfortable being part of whatever this was, but he cupped his hands around his mouth and whispered something inaudible. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling. Sophie, Martin said gently. What did he say? Every eye swiveled to her. Sophie sat very still, her head tilted slightly, the way she always held it when she was really concentrating on sound. Charles, she said clearly. He said Charles. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Raymond's face went pale. Is that correct, officer? The judge asked, her voice sharp with interest. Raymond swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor, that's my son's name. I don't understand how she could have. Because she hears what we can't, Martin said, his voice ringing with conviction. He turned to Sophie. How far away was Officer Raymond? Sophie didn't even pause. 42 feet, 7 inches. And you heard a whisper from that distance? Yes. Through ambient noise? Through people breathing and shifting and the air conditioning running? Yes. Martin let that sit for a moment. Let the impossibility of it sink in. Then he turned to Chen. Would you like to test her again? Choose any person in this courtroom. Have them whisper anything they want from anywhere in the room. Let's see if Sophie can hear it. Chen's face had gone tight. She knew she'd been cornered. If she refused, it would look like she was afraid. If she accepted and Sophie succeeded again, it would demolish her entire cross-examination. I'll do it, Laura said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood in the gallery, her face composed, but her eyes blazing with something dark and dangerous. "I'm her mother," Laura continued with false reasonableness. "If anyone should test her abilities, it should be me." Martin hesitated. I could see him weighing the risk, but the judge nodded. "Proceed, Mrs. Walker." Laura walked to the back of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the tile floor. That sound, sharp, precise, unmistakable. Click, 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 click. Just like Sophie had described, she turned to face us, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned against the wall and whispered something. The courtroom held its breath. Sophie's hands began to shake. Her face went white. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, recognition, something worse? "What did she say, Sophie?" Martin asked gently. Sophie's mouth opened closed. Her breathing quickened into something that sounded like the edge of panic. "I can't," she whispered. "Yes, you can," Martin encouraged. "Just tell us what you heard." "No." Sophie's voice rose, sharp and frightened. "I can't say it. I can't." Laura smiled, a cold, terrible smile. "Your Honor," Chen interjected smoothly. "Clearly the witness is—" "She said I love you, Sophie, but sometimes love isn't enough." Sophie burst out, the words tumbling over each other in her rush to speak. She said it in the voice she uses when she's pretending. The frequency modulation is different when she's lying. Higher pitch variation, rapid alternation between soft and loud. She was using that voice the night Father died, too, when she said whatever she said before he fell. That's how I knew it was her. The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel cracked repeatedly. Laura's face drained of all color. She started to speak, to protest, but her lawyer grabbed her arm with white-knuckled force. Martin stood frozen for a moment, stunned by what Sophie had just revealed. Then he recovered, his training kicking in. "Sophie," he said carefully, "you're saying you can identify not just voices but emotional states? Deception?" "Lies have a pattern," Sophie said, still shaking but her voice growing stronger. "Micro-hesitations, pitch inconsistencies, unnatural emphasis. Mother's voice changes when she lies. Everyone's does, but hers has specific markers. When she said she loved me just now, her pitch rose 12 hertz above her baseline and dropped 7 hertz below within the same sentence. That's her lying pattern. She used the same pattern that night." She looked directly at Laura for the first time. "You were pretending to talk nicely to Father, but your voice had the lying pattern. And then he fell. And then you left. And then you came back and screamed, but your scream had the lying pattern too." The silence that followed was absolute suffocating. Then Laura started to laugh, not the bright, false laugh she'd perfected over the years. This was something darker. Unhinged, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed mask had finally shattered. "You're 12 years old," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're autistic. You count floor tiles and freak out when things aren't symmetrical. And you expect these people to believe you can hear lies?" "I don't expect anything," Sophie said quietly. "I just report what I hear." She looked at Martin, then at me, then at George, who was watching her with something like awe. "Mr. George's voice doesn't have deception patterns," Sophie continued. "When he said he didn't do it, his pitch was consistent. His rhythm was steady. He was telling the truth. But Mother—" She turned back to Laura. "Mother's voice has been lying since Father died. Every time she cried, every time she said she missed him, every time she looked at me and said everything would be okay, lies. All lies." Laura's laughter cut off abruptly. Her face twisted into something ugly. "You little—" she started, taking a step forward. The bailiff moved to intercept her, but not before everyone in that courtroom saw what I'd seen in our kitchen. Not the composed widow, not the devoted mother, the monster. "Mrs. Walker," the judge said sharply, "sit down, now." Laura sat, but her eyes never left Sophie. And in those eyes I saw calculation, rage, and something that looked terrifyingly like desperation. Martin turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to recall Mrs. Laura Walker to the stand. I have some questions about her whereabouts on the night of the murder and about a certain life insurance policy that was updated 6 months before my client's death. Chen shot to her feet. Objection! This is a preliminary hearing for Mr. Harris, not a trial for Mrs. Walker. This is completely inappropriate. Overruled, the judge said, her voice hard. Mrs. Walker will take the stand and counsel her. She looked at Laura's lawyer. You may want to advise your client of her Fifth Amendment rights. The courtroom buzzed with excitement. Reporters were already texting their editors. George was staring at Sophie like she'd just performed a miracle. And Laura? Laura stood slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. She walked to the witness stand like a woman going to the gallows. When she sat down, she looked directly at me and mouthed 2 words. This isn't over. Laura's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear. I could see his jaw working, see the tension in his shoulders. He was telling her to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights, to stay silent, to protect herself. But Laura pushed him away with a sharp gesture. Her face had gone cold, calculating. She'd decided something in that moment, something that made my stomach clench with dread. I'll answer questions, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. I have nothing to hide. It was a lie. I could hear it even without Sophie's gift. Could hear the tremor underneath the confidence. Could see the way her hands gripped the armrests too tightly, knuckles white with strain. Martin approached slowly, a lion stalking wounded prey. Mrs. Walker, he began, his tone deceptively gentle. Where were you on the evening of August 3rd between 7:30 and 8 p.m.? I was upstairs with Sophie, Laura answered smoothly, helping her with homework. And you heard nothing unusual during that time? Nothing until She paused, her voice catching with practiced grief. Until the thud. And then I ran downstairs and found Daniel. What time did you run downstairs? I don't know exactly. 7:50? Everything happened so fast. Martin nodded, making notes on his legal pad. So to be clear, you were upstairs the entire time until you heard your husband fall? Yes. You never went downstairs? Never opened the garden door? Never spoke to your husband before he died? Laura's eyes flashed. No, I already told the police all this. Martin walked to his table and picked up a document. Mrs. Walker, do you recognize this email? He handed it to her. I watched her face as she read it, watched the color drain away, watched her eyes widen with something that looked like panic before she mastered it. She started, then stopped. Where did you get this? From your husband's computer, Martin said calmly. He printed it out, made notes on it, highlighted certain sections. Would you like to read those highlighted sections to the court? Laura's hands trembled as she held the paper. She glanced at her lawyer, who looked equally stunned. He clearly hadn't seen this document before. This is private correspondence, Laura said, her voice thin and strained, between husband and wife. It's evidence, Martin countered. Evidence that goes to motive. Your Honor, may I read the relevant portions? The judge nodded, her eyes sharp with interest. Martin took the document back. This is an email dated July 15th, approximately 3 weeks before Daniel Walker's death. It's from Daniel to his wife. I'll read the highlighted sections. He cleared his throat. Laura, I've discovered the withdrawals. $20,000 over 6 months. I've also found the credit card you opened in my name without my knowledge. The debt is catastrophic. I've consulted with a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. You'll get nothing from me. The prenup is ironclad, and I'm removing you as beneficiary on my life insurance policy, effective immediately. The courtroom exploded. The judge's gavel couldn't contain it this time. Reporters were shouting questions. Laura's lawyer was on his feet, objecting to something, though his words were lost in the chaos. I just sat there, frozen. $20,000, secret debt, divorce. No wonder Daniel had seemed distracted those last weeks. No wonder he'd been working late, consulting lawyers, organizing his affairs. He'd been preparing to leave her, and she'd killed him for it. Order, the judge shouted, her gavel cracking like gunshots. "I will clear this courtroom if necessary." The noise subsided into tense whispers. Laura sat rigid in the witness chair, her face a mask of fury and fear. "Mrs. Walker," Martin continued, his voice cutting through the remaining murmurs, "did you know about this email?" Yes. "So you knew your husband planned to divorce you, to cut you off financially, to remove you from his life insurance policy?" "Yes." The word came out choked, desperate. "A life insurance policy worth $500,000? Laura's eyes darted around the courtroom, looking for escape, finding none. "Yes." "And did your husband follow through? Did he remove you as beneficiary?" A long pause, then barely audible, "No." "Why not?" "I don't know, maybe he changed his mind." "Or maybe," Martin suggested, his voice hardening, "he didn't have time, because 3 days after writing that email, he was dead." Laura's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Speculation! Mr. Hale is leading the witness and making accusations that—" "Sustained," the judge said, but her tone was perfunctory. Everyone in that courtroom knew what they were hearing. Everyone understood what it meant. Martin shifted tactics. "Mrs. Walker, what shoes were you wearing the night your husband died?" The question caught her off guard. "Shoes? I don't remember." "Think carefully. What shoes were you wearing when you ran downstairs and found your husband's body?" "I was barefoot," she said quickly. Too quickly. "I'd been relaxing in our bedroom." "Barefoot," Martin repeated. "You're certain?" "Yes." Martin nodded slowly. Then he walked to his table and picked up another evidence bag. Inside was a pair of black high heels. "Do you recognize these shoes?" Laura's face went gray. Those might be mine. I have several pairs of black heels." "These were found in your bedroom closet," Martin said. "The forensics team examined them 2 days ago. Would you like to know what they found?" Laura didn't answer, just stared at the shoes like they were poisonous snakes. "Microscopic traces of your husband's blood," Martin said quietly. "On the right heel, the lab confirmed it, DNA match." The courtroom went deadly silent. "How did your husband's blood get on your shoes, Mrs. Walker? If you were barefoot upstairs the entire time?" Laura's mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. "Perhaps," Martin continued, his voice gentle but relentless. "It happened when you walked away from his body. When you took those 23 steps, Sophie counted click, 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 the heels she heard leaving the scene." "No." Laura's voice was barely a whisper. "You were there," Martin pressed. "You confronted him about the divorce, about the insurance. Maybe you just wanted to talk, to convince him, but it escalated, and you—" "I didn't mean to." Laura's voice cracked, raw and desperate. The words burst out before she could stop them. "He was going to leave me with nothing. After everything I'd sacrificed, after 15 years of—" She stopped. Her hand flew to her mouth like she could push the words back in. But it was too late. The confession was out, hanging in the air like smoke. Her lawyer grabbed her arm, hissing urgently, "Don't say another word. Don't—" But Laura wasn't listening anymore. The dam had broken. Years of lies and pretense came flooding out in a torrent of rage and grief and terrible justification. "He treated me like a servant," she continued, her voice rising to something shrill and unhinged. "Made me account for every penny, criticized everything I did. And then he tells me he's leaving, that I get nothing, that he's taking Sophie and I'll be alone and broke and—" She was crying now. Real tears this time, not the practiced, performative grief she'd shown at the funeral. This was raw, ugly, true. "I went downstairs to talk to him, just talk, but he laughed at me, said I should have thought about consequences before stealing from him, called me a thief in my own home, and I grabbed the bookend from the shelf. I didn't think, I just swung and—" She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Even the reporters had stopped writing. We all just watched as Laura Walker, composed, elegant Laura, fell completely apart. He hit the floor so hard, she whispered through her tears. And I knew. I knew he was dead, and I panicked. I threw the bookend in the garden, planted it near where George kept his tools, ran upstairs, changed my shoes, hid the heels, came back down and screamed like I just found him. She looked up, her tear-stained face twisted with something that might have been regret or might have been self-pity. I never meant for George to take the blame, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant for any of this. I just wanted to not lose everything. Martin stood very still, letting her words echo in the silence, then quietly. And Sophie? Your daughter heard everything. She knew. What were you going to do about that? Laura's eyes snapped to where Sophie sat in the gallery beside me. Something cold and terrible crossed her face. She's autistic, Laura said flatly, all trace of tears suddenly gone. No one would have believed her. I made sure she doubted herself, made her think her memories were confused. If you hadn't interfered. She stopped, seemed to realize what she just admitted. If we hadn't interfered, I said, standing up despite the bailiff's gesture to sit down, you would have let an innocent man rot in prison, and you would have spent the rest of your life gaslighting your own daughter into believing she was crazy. Laura looked at me with eyes that held nothing human. I would have done whatever was necessary to survive, and there it was, the monster, fully exposed, not sorry for what she'd done, just sorry she'd been caught. The judge's gavel fell like a death sentence. Mrs. Walker, you are under arrest for the murder of Daniel Walker. Officers, please take her into custody. Two bailiffs moved toward Laura. She didn't resist. Just stood slowly, her movements mechanical, her face blank. As they led her past me, she stopped, leaned in close enough that only I could hear. You destroyed your own family for this, she whispered, her voice cold and poisonous. You chose a dead son over a living granddaughter? She'll never forgive you. Then she was gone, led away in handcuffs, her heels clicking one final time against the courthouse floor. I sank back into my seat, Laura's words echoing in my head. Sophie turned to me, her dark eyes searching my face. Grandma, she said quietly, did we do the right thing? And God help me, I didn't know how to answer. The weeks after Laura's arrest were the hardest of my life, harder even than losing Daniel, because grief, terrible as it is, at least makes sense. You lose someone you love and you hurt. Simple, brutal, but comprehensible. This was different. This was grief tangled with guilt, with doubt, with the awful question that kept me awake night after night. Had I sacrificed my granddaughter's peace for my own need for truth? Sophie stopped speaking for 3 days after the trial, just went silent. She'd sit at the kitchen table, counting her cereal pieces, arranging them in patterns only she understood. When I'd ask if she was okay, she'd nod, but her eyes stayed empty, distant, like she'd retreated somewhere I couldn't follow. I called Martin on the 4th day, my voice shaking with panic. She won't talk to me, she won't eat properly, she's disappeared inside herself. Martin came over that afternoon, found Sophie in the garden kneeling in the dirt where George used to work. She'd planted something, tiny seeds in careful rows. What are you planting? Martin asked gently, not expecting an answer. Sophie looked up at him, her face streaked with soil and tears. Forget-me-nots, she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Father liked them. He said they were honest flowers because their name tells you exactly what they want. Martin knelt beside her, his old knees creaking. Your father was a wise man. Grandma thinks I hate her, Sophie said matter-of-factly. Her breathing pattern changed after Mother was arrested faster, shallower. That's the pattern for guilt and fear. She thinks she hurt me by making me testify. Did she hurt you? Martin asked carefully. Sophie considered this, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. Yes, she finally said, but the truth hurt less than the lie would have Mother's voice had the lying pattern every day. Every single day since Father died. It made my ears hurt, made my brain hurt trying to reconcile what I heard with what I was supposed to believe. She looked at Martin with those enormous dark eyes. Is it wrong that I'm glad Mother is gone? Even though she's my mother? Martin's voice was thick with emotion when he answered. No, sweetheart, it's not wrong. Love and relief can exist in the same heart. So can grief and gratitude. Sophie nodded slowly, processing this. Then she stood, brushing dirt from her knees. I need to tell Grandma that. She needs to hear my breathing pattern when I say I'm okay, so she'll know I'm not lying. That evening, Sophie found me in Daniel's study. I'd been going through his things, trying to understand what I'd missed, how I'd lived with a monster for 15 years and never seen it. Sophie didn't say anything at first, just came and sat beside me, her small body warm against my side. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the house settle, to the wind moving through the garden, to the ordinary sounds of life continuing despite everything. I heard your question, Sophie finally said, in the courtroom. You asked yourself if we did the right thing. Your subvocalization pattern was clear. You were doubting. I turned to look at her. Subvocalization? When people think in words, their vocal cords make tiny movements. Sophie explained in that lecturing tone. Most people can't hear it, but I can. You were asking yourself if truth was worth the cost. And what's your answer? I asked, my voice barely steady. Sophie was quiet for a moment, her head tilted in that listening way. Father used to tell me that truth is like sound, she said softly. It travels through everything, through walls, through time, through people's attempts to contain it. You can muffle it, you can pretend it doesn't exist, but it's always there, vibrating, waiting to be heard. She looked at me with Daniel's eyes. If we'd let Mother's lie continue, it would have kept vibrating, in George's cell, in my memory, in your conscience. The sound would have gotten louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. Tears spilled down my cheeks. But what about you? You lost your mother because of me, because I couldn't let it go. I lost my mother the night she killed my father, Sophie corrected gently. You didn't take her from me. She took herself, and you... Her voice wavered slightly, showing emotion beneath the flat affect. You believed me when nobody else would. You chose truth even when it hurt. That's what Father would have wanted. That's what love actually looks like. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I'm sad and scared, and sometimes I'm angry, but I'm not sorry, and I don't hate you. My breathing pattern is steady. My heart rate is normal. I'm telling the truth. I pulled her close, this strange, brilliant, broken girl who'd somehow become the strongest person I knew. I love you, Sophie. I know, she said simply. Your voice has never had the lying pattern with me. Not once. George was released 2 days later. The charges dropped. His name cleared. Martin and I went to pick him up from the county jail. He walked out into the sunlight, blinking like a man emerging from a cave. When he saw me, he stopped. We stood there in the parking lot, this man I'd suspected, then believed, then fought for. This innocent man whose life had been nearly destroyed by my family's poison. Mr. George, I said, my voice breaking. I'm so sorry, He held up a hand, stopping me. Mrs. Walker, he said with that quiet dignity that had always been his nature, you saved my life. You could have let me take the fall, could have protected your family's reputation, but you chose truth instead. That's nothing to apologize for. But we're the reason you were arrested in the first place, I insisted. Laura planted that evidence because she was evil, George interrupted gently. Not because you were. Not because Daniel was evil exists, Mrs. Walker. Sometimes it lives in our houses, sleeps in our beds, sits at our tables. That's not your fault. He looked past me to where Sophie stood by the car, watching us. That little girl has a gift, he said. She hears truth. Most people spend their whole lives running from it, but she runs toward it. You taught her that, you and Daniel. He extended his hand. I took it, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that came from honest work. Thank you, he said simply, for believing, for fighting, for being brave enough to hear what nobody else would. 3 months later, the garden was in full bloom. George had come back to work, not because we asked, but because he said he needed to. Gardens don't care about human drama, he told me with a small smile. They just need tending. Sophie and I fell into a new rhythm, quieter than before, more careful, but also more honest. She'd tell me when she heard my anxiety pattern. I'd tell her when I saw her retreating into patterns and counting. We learned to speak each other's languages, sound and silence, truth and grace. One afternoon in late October, Sophie and I were sitting on the back porch. The forget-me-nots had bloomed where she'd planted them, tiny blue flowers that bobbed in the breeze. The air smelled like autumn, wood smoke and dying leaves and the dark, rich scent of earth preparing for winter. "Grandma," Sophie said suddenly, her head tilted toward the garden, "the wind is talking." I'd heard her say this before, this strange phrase that sounded like the imagination of a much younger child, but I'd learned to take Sophie's perceptions seriously. "What's it saying?" I asked. Sophie closed her eyes, listening with that total concentration that was uniquely hers. "It's saying that Father is in the soil now, in the flowers, in the leaves. It's saying that truth doesn't bring people back, but it lets them rest properly. It's saying—" She opened her eyes and looked at me. "It's saying that you can stop being afraid now, that I'm going to be okay, that we're going to be okay." I listened, really listened, the way Sophie had taught me. And maybe it was imagination, maybe it was grief playing tricks, or maybe, just maybe, it was something real. But I heard it, that whisper in the wind, that sound of forgiveness, of release, of peace earned through pain. "Yes," I whispered back, "I hear it too." Sophie smiled a real smile, small but genuine. She took my hand, her fingers cool and thin but strong. We sat there as the afternoon faded into evening, listening to the wind talk, to the garden breathe, to the sound of truth that had destroyed and redeemed us. Laura had been right about one thing. I had chosen a dead son over a living granddaughter. But what she didn't understand, what she could never understand, was that I'd also chosen truth over comfortable lies, integrity over easy peace. And in doing so, I'd given Sophie something more valuable than a mother who loved conditionally. I'd given her a grandmother who loved honestly. The garden bloomed. Life continued. And when the wind moved through those forget-me-nots, Sophie would close her eyes and listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd smile and say, "Father says you did good, Grandma. He says he's proud." I don't know if she really heard him or if she was hearing what she needed to hear, but it doesn't matter. Because either way, it was true truth, I'd learned, isn't about being right. It's about being honest. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is destroy what's broken so something real can grow in its place. The sound of truth is painful, shattering, unforgiving, but God, it's also beautiful. And in the end, it's the only sound worth hearing.